We're really thrilled to be bringing you the third in our series on advocacy training from the Epilepsy Leadership Council in partnership with a number of community groups to bring this kind of information to you. You'll see when we introduce the speakers, we've got a wide range of folks working with us on this. And today we're really digging into how to take action. We know this is something that people wanted to know a lot more about. How do I do this? How do I engage? How do I make my voice heard? How do I speak up for my community? And so today's session is really going to give you some tips and tools about how to do that from people who have been doing this work for some time. So we're thrilled that you're with us. And here's our agenda for today. I'm Gabi Conacher. I'm the ELC chair, so I'm kind of your host to kick us off today. But you'll see that we've got Britt Dorfman with the Epilepsy Foundation, Katie Smith with TSC Alliance, Liz Powell with G2G Consulting, and Epilepsy's Action Network. And we're really taking you on this journey to help you think a little bit more about how powerful your story is. How do you meet with congressional offices? What does that look like? What does that entail? How to make sure that you prepare for that? And then how ongoing communication really looks with those offices. So we think this is going to be a really powerful tool, an ongoing tool for the community to hopefully be able to access and find to help them on their journeys of advocacy. Next slide, please. So why are we doing this? ELC is embarking on this advocacy trilogy of webinars, really because that is what the community has asked for. We did our survey with the community, and one of the things that really came to the forefront was that people want to better understand what advocacy is, how to do it, and how to engage in it. And so we worked really hard on this 3-part series with partners from, Epilepsy's Action Network, EF, TSC Alliance, and other friends to help us really think about how to bring you the information to better understand how to advocate. So this is being recorded and will be an evergreen resource for the whole community. Please, throughout, drop your questions and thoughts in the chat. And we will have a Q&A at the end. And you're welcome to drop your questions in throughout so you don't forget them. And I started talking a little bit about this, but next slide. Why we're doing this training is because we heard the community that this is what they're looking for. In 2018, the Epilepsy Leadership Council developed a policy agenda that has really helped us look at what the kinds of issues that we want to support. And the things that really rose to importance there were research in epilepsy, surveillance and data collection and prevention, and access to care. And we're currently updating our policy with Joanna Gray and Laura Widener kind of helping lead the ELC working group to do that, and a number of members who are working with us to do that. So thank you, all of you who are serving on that. And so be on the lookout for more on that soon. Next slide, please. So as all of you who are on this call likely either chimed in to say that you wanted to learn more about advocacy, or you clearly want to because you're here today, this was really what rose to the top for a lot of ELC members, that they want to know how to do this work. So this series was really looking at how to explain how the legislative process works, how different government agencies work, and advocacy tactics, which is what we're talking about today. If you're interested in part 1 and 2, they are, we will drop those links into the chat and make sure that you have access to those. And please let us know if there are other advocacy topics that you want to hear more about. Feel free to drop that in the chat. You can email me or Anne, and we're always wanting to hear more from all of you. All right, next slide. I think we're jumping in. I'm going to hand it off to Britt. Thank you so much for joining us today, Britt, to share your insights in your work with the Epilepsy Foundation.
Thanks, Gabi. Really excited to be here. And I'm really excited to talk about the importance of sharing your story and your loved one's stories. If you don't already know, lawmakers are constantly making decisions that can impact someone's life. They're constantly working on different policies that can impact the community in in so many different ways, whether you know it or not. And something that you may not know, or something that might not be as clear as those of us who are continuously working in this field, is that members of Congress really do value their constituents' input. They rely on constituents' views to help form those decisions and educate them about how their policy decisions can impact the people that are in their district or in their state. Next slide, please. Your story is one of your best advocacy tools. You know, you don't have to go far. It's your own shared experience or your loved ones' experiences. Like I said, policymakers are constantly making decisions that can impact people in the community. And so by sharing your story, you can really put a face to a lot of complicated issues and form an emotional connection with these members of Congress and their staff, or any elected official at any level. Sharing your story can really help amplify not just your voice, but the voice of so many other people in the community who may not be as willing to share their story yet. And it can even help some people kind of get more comfortable and want to share their own story. The more you all share your stories and the stories of your loved ones, you might be you're forging the path for those who have not shared yet and really want to and just haven't felt empowered to do so. And there's research that proves that constituent voices do make a difference, whether it feels that way or not. And that's something that might not be as clear, you know, when you're hearing the news or reading the news, it might not be as clear that your voices can make a difference. Next slide. Just some quick data. I'm not going to go really deep into this, but the Congressional Management Foundation has done a lot of research on a lot of this, you know, what can make an impact at the federal level. So you can see that in-person visits from constituents has a lot of influence on a member or a senator's decision if they haven't already arrived at how they're going to vote or how they're going to make a decision on a certain policy. And then you can see a little bit down that individualized messages, so more those emails or maybe even a phone call, 17% also has a lot of influence. So, you know, you don't have to be a lobbyist to make a really big impact. In fact, you probably can make a bigger impact than some lobbyists. Hope I don't offend anyone saying that. Next slide. And then here we just have some more data that shows really, you know, from the perspective of a staff member, I believe, in your opinion, how important is each for understanding constituents' views and opinions? You can see that full 99% meetings between staff and constituents has very important and somewhat important impact. So, sharing your story can make a huge difference. Next slide. All right, well, I've talked about why it's important to share your story, but of course, actually sharing your story is a whole nother ballgame. It might not be something that many people are comfortable with, and it can take some practice, but I have some tips that can help you craft your story when it comes to speaking with elected officials. So keep in mind your story should be timely. You don't have a lot of time to speak with members of Congress and their staff. We'll talk about that a little bit later. So you should try to keep your story short and concise, just a couple of minutes. You want to highlight your connection to the office, really highlight your constituency, where you're from. Maybe the person you're speaking to is from your same hometown. Maybe you went to high school with that person. Maybe you have a special connection to an elected official. You never know. Just be sure to share that connection. And then, of course, the bulk of your story is really your journey or your loved one's journey. Everything from your diagnosis to the kinds of treatments to challenges and even triumphs. So, you want to share things that have really made a deep impact on your own experience. And you want to share that with them so that they can understand where you're coming from. And of course, that helps connect to making an emotional appeal. You want to really connect your story with the policy that you're there to talk to them about, how that policy would impact you, how it would impact anyone in the community. And then last but not least, you really want to be very specific when you make your ask about the specific policy. Next slide. And then just a couple of helpful prompts, particularly when you're trying to talk about your journey. Of course, many people have been living with epilepsy or the epilepsies for a very long time. So you have a lot of experience and a lot of potential challenges or potential triumphs that you can share. And so, trying to condense that down into a short snippet for a meeting with a congressional office can be really difficult. So like I said, when you start, you really want to mention who you are, where you're from. And then in terms of your journey, talk about the age that you or your loved one was when they were diagnosed, what kind of seizures you or they experience, the number of medications that you've tried or surgeries, dietary therapies, and any alternative treatments. Anything that you feel that you are willing to share, you can share. And then, when you're talking about the number of medications and dietary therapies and treatments, it's really to kind of give that qualitative and quantitative information to them. Asking if they know what epilepsy is or know what specific condition that you may live with or your loved one lives with can also be another helpful thing to ask so that you can kind of gauge how much you need to share. Next slide. And so, like I said before, your story is your best tool. So you don't need to be a policy expert. And sometimes it's better if you're not. You're really wanting to tell your lived experience and how everything that they're working on Capitol Hill or the state legislature can really impact you and your loved ones. You're the expert of your own experience. And so you want to kind of paint that picture for them. I highly recommend practicing sharing your story, writing it down, talking to yourself in the mirror, practicing a couple of times can be really helpful. You don't need to memorize anything, but just practicing might make you feel more comfortable going into a meeting. And then, of course, there are also times when sharing your story might be a little bit emotional. I work with advocates who are parents of children who have gone through a lot. I work with advocates who have unfortunately lost their loved ones. So there are definitely times it can be emotional, and that's okay. I don't think anyone should be afraid of showing a little bit of emotion. If there's something that you want to share that might make you too emotional, you don't have to share that just yet. And you can always follow up with an office and share more details over email that you might be more comfortable sharing that way. Next slide. So one of the most important things you can do, not just sharing your own story, but is connecting your story with the policy that you're there to talk to them about. You can have a really big impact by making that connection, by pairing your story with a really clear policy ask. And I usually recommend tailoring your story for the specific policy issue. So if you're going to talk to an office about step therapy, if you have a step therapy story, that would be a great time to share that specific story. And, any more details that can make that clear of how, that policy decision could impact you and how that policy has already impacted your life. We use the hook, line, sinker approach with this connecting your story with a policy. So basically it's, a fishing analogy. You're trying to hook them in, talking first about who you are, relating to them, your constituency. You've already got that one, should be fairly simple. Then you're starting to reel them in, your line. You're sharing your story a little bit, relating, how does this issue relate to your life? How will this proposed policy change help you or harm you? And then, of course, you really want to reel them in. You want to catch that fish. You're going to want, what do you want them to do? Be as specific as possible. These are your elected officials. They're probably not going to commit to anything, but be very specific in your ask to them. Next slide. And of course, advocacy is a year-long process. Sharing your story once is really wonderful and really great. But advocacy is not a one and done. So as many times as you can share your story, especially with elected officials, is really important, and trying to build that rapport with them. So those personal interactions, what we talked about a little bit earlier from that data, can really make an impact over time as you're trying to build relationships with elected officials and their staff. And I think just some, final tips. Keep your story short and sweet, about 2 to 3 minutes. But like I said, as you're building relationships, you're going to be able to share more of your story with them over time. You don't need to share everything with them all at once. Really want to tailor your story, share what you're comfortable with. And so each story is unique. And so like I said, as you build relationships with congressional offices, you can share more details as they become pertinent over time. And like I said, really tailoring those messages and your story. One of the most important things that you can do, especially if you're unable to have your loved one with you, if they are the one who's living with with epilepsy or seizure disorder, bring a picture of them with you, or share that via email before or after you meet with that office. I highly recommend putting together some kind of visual to bring with you or leave behind. It can be very simple, a Word document with a little bit of your story and a picture. You can get as creative as possible with it. But having that visual, especially if they're unable to be there, can really make a big impact. And I've seen that happen in a lot of congressional offices. I'll pass it over to Katie.
Thanks, Britt. Hi, everybody. I'm Katie Smith. I am the Director of Government and Global Affairs at the TSC Alliance. I'm very glad to be with you this afternoon. Next slide. Thank you. I'm going to talk a little bit about how to request a meeting and kind of what to expect during your meeting. So to request a meeting to start, it's obviously important you know who you're trying to meet with or who your your members of Congress are. So you can find that at house.gov and senate.gov, where you can go and put in your zip code or your state, and it will pull up who your member of Congress is. So then you can go to their website, and they usually list contact information, where their office is located, a phone number. A lot of them have like contact us forms that you can fill out. We typically, for our advocacy, recommend calling the office and trying to get the name of somebody, particularly that works in what you are wanting to meet with the office about. So for example, we advocate for the Tuberous Sclerosis Complex Research Program in the Department of Defense. So we recommend that our advocates call and ask if they can speak with the to help the person that handles defense appropriations or defense issues. Certainly a lot of what we do would also be something that a health staffer may be able to help with. So I think it's also important to remember too that the offices are very busy, and sometimes it can take a couple of times to get through to the office. So certainly if you have called and haven't heard anything back, then we recommend calling again and following up. I think it usually when you're wanting to have a meeting, like maybe 2 or 3 weeks ahead of time is a good time, or maybe 4, to request your meeting and start contacting the office to get that set up. The other thing that would be important to remember when you're requesting the meeting is what type of meeting you're wanting to have. And especially now during this time of virtual meetings and in-person meetings, it's very important to make sure that you clarify which type of meeting you're wanting to have. Next slide, please. Thanks. So in the meeting, they typically last about 15 to 20 minutes. And when you are setting up your meeting, they may tell you if the congressperson or representative or senator will be able to be in the meeting with you or not. Oftentimes you'll be meeting with the staffer that handles whatever issue you've contacted the office about. And that is great. Staffers do a lot to help all of the causes that we are advocating for, and are it's a key relationship to build within the office. So during your meeting, you would start with introductions and give an overview of why you requested the meeting. As Britt mentioned, it's very important to make your ask and let the office know how they may be able to support. We typically try to encourage people to get the ask out earlier in the conversation, just to make sure if anything happens that you've already stated what is important to you and what you are hoping the office will do. And then it's incredibly important to also thank them for the meeting and thank them for taking the time to meet with you. I think it's very important for legislators to hear from their constituents. So I think sometimes it can be a little bit intimidating to think about what to expect during a meeting, but you have to remember that this is what they're there to be doing, and that's part of their job, is to meet with you. So I think usually we find once people go through a meeting or two, then it becomes a little bit easier, but I know certainly in the beginning it can be a little daunting, and I think that's why it's also really important to think about whatever you're advocating for, working with the organization that may be working on or advocating for a similar thing, and they can often provide some guidance and materials for your meeting. Next slide, please. So the other thing is that since COVID now, we do have this option of virtual meetings and in-person meetings, both in Washington and at the local district level. So we found 2 years ago, we had our advocacy completely virtually. And this past year, we had it sort of half virtual and half in person in Washington. And we actually did find, I think we will never go back to solely doing in-person meetings, just because we can only bring a limited number of people to Washington, DC, to help advocate for whatever specific, for like TSC research funding, for example. And with the virtual option now, we're able to involve more people in the community. It's really important usually for legislators to hear from people, from their constituents and people in their district. So if somebody is maybe not able to come to Washington or may not be able to travel to a local office to do a district meeting, it's great that they will be able to hear from their constituents through a virtual meeting. It also, I think, really helps for accessibility. If you're unable to travel, if you're unable to take time off of work, this may be an easier option for you. And we've even had somebody who took a meeting from the hospital, for example. So I think that this is a really good option, and I'm glad that we're able to, that it still exists and hasn't gone away now that we're doing more things in person. And then obviously there is a lot of value in face-to-face meetings. I think when we do our March on Capitol Hill or advocacy fly-in, I think certainly there's power in numbers. So we often we'll get comments about like seeing our advocates wearing blue on Capitol Hill, and people know what they're there, or what we're there for. I think so there's a lot of value to that, but just because you can't come to DC or just because you cannot go to a local office, that shouldn't discourage you from advocating, because we're able to do things differently. And this graph is just an example of inquiring from some of the offices about how influential in-person and virtual meetings were. As you can see, both of them did end up having some influence. So I think it's really good that we are having this option to be able to advocate in many different ways. Next slide, please. So finally, tips for successful meetings. And I've included here a checklist of one of our volunteers actually put together and things that she thought about as she was preparing for her meeting. So I think it's really important to make sure that you come prepared and think about what you're going to be meeting about. Are you having materials? Oftentimes, if you circulate them to the office or the person you're meeting with ahead of time, they'll read it. And then you just have a little bit more that you can discuss in your meeting. I think it's important to learn about your member of Congress and just to get a little bit of background information on kind of what things they support or what issues are important to them. I think it's really helpful going in just being aware a little bit of who you're meeting. Would also recommend, and I think Britt mentioned this too, practicing what you're going to say ahead of time. We found this is especially important in meetings where we have a lot of people that will attend. So not everybody needs to talk, but knowing what each person is going to say is really important because you want to make sure that you are staying on message and getting your point across. And it's easiest to do that if you're concise and each person has a role and knows what they'll be able to do in the meeting. We also recommend remaining flexible. Oftentimes you may be meeting with somebody, if you're coming to Washington, for example, you may meet with somebody in the office or you may have to meet with them in a hallway. Sometimes times change for meetings and based on something that might come up in Congress. So it's just good to be a little bit flexible and just know that the office is doing what they can to meet with you. And I think remaining flexible as well is just really helpful in thinking about your ask and how you're giving your message. I think too, we've also had things like we'll have like a congressperson drop into a meeting, which then is a little bit off script, but also very nice for the constituent to be able to meet their member of Congress. And then lastly, as Britt mentioned also, do be sure to send a thank you note. It's really important that they hear from you following the meeting. A thank you note is also a good opportunity to remind them of your meeting and to include any follow-up items that might have come up in the meeting that you didn't know the answer to. And I think that's another point is just if you're in your meeting and you're having a conversation and you don't have all of the answers that come up in the conversation, that's okay too. There are plenty of opportunities to follow up and get back to the office if you need to find more information out about something. And I think that is all. Thank you.
Great. I'm Liz Powell. I'm with G2G Consulting and the Epilepsy Action Network. I'm talking about effective email communications, pretty similar to the other advice that you've already received. It's really important to be short and to the point so that people can understand you. I used to work on the Hill and I was very stressed out with meetings throughout the day, hundreds and hundreds of emails. And that is what the staff are feeling. So if you can be short and to the point, that's ideal. And in fact, if you have a half an hour meeting and you're done in 20 minutes, golden. Staff love that because you just gave them 10 minutes back. So bullet points are really good. That's definitely how I communicate in all my email and verbal communications. Personalizing, especially members of Congress, their number one concern is the ability to get reelected. And how do they do that with constituents voting for them? So you want to talk about how it connects back home to your city, your region, the district, state, etc. And then following up and saying thank you, as my colleagues already talked about, is very important.
And one thing you can be plugging always, an easy ask relatively, is to join the Epilepsy Caucus, which is something that Laura Widener took an awesome leadership role in getting established this year. So we're always plugging that. Every meeting that we have, we always say that at the end of the meeting to please join the caucus. So that's a nice one. Next slide, please. Inviting members of Congress to events is really important. Don't be upset though if the member can't come. I mean, getting district staff to come to an event in the district is awesome. Getting staff to come to these congressional briefings has been a great way to educate them. And again, as a former staffer, I would lobby my boss all the time on issues. And so we want those staffers lobbying for us to say how important epilepsies are. Let's see, being flexible is very important. Understanding that they are juggling, especially if it's on the Hill. They usually can only stop by for 5 or 10 minutes. It's super brief. And if it's an evening event, I remember the schedule, we would have like 3 receptions in one night. So, you take what you can get, do the best with that. I talked about staff. Tours back home are really good. It's a great way to connect personally. It's very memorable to meet someone in person as opposed to a Zoom call or like a quick visit on the Hill. If they actually come out, spend an hour with you in the district, that's huge. And then always sending that thank you. We always talk about that. So you've heard that many times. Thank you is always important. Next slide, please. Social media engagement. This day and age, that's what it's all about. So definitely want to post those pictures. Now members and staff are used to it. They're generally fine with it. Of course, you always ask first, but they like to have their pictures out there and to get nice postings. They definitely will, often they'll retweet. It's really important that you're tagging their official account, not their political account. We as nonprofits, we do not want to get involved in politics. So always make sure you're doing their official account. You can do that both on LinkedIn and Twitter or X or Instagram, Facebook, other medias. Engage your network. So if you've got, you had the member out, you had a great visit, you got some good pictures, let your whole community know about it. Get everyone to start retweeting the same post over and over again. That will really get it on the attention of the member. And then you can come up with a hashtag that everyone is using. So that's a great way to amplify and elevate your issue and organization. And then again, thank you. Lots of thank yous. It's always nice to send a thank you. And in fact, I recently did an event. We were working with the Congresswoman in Washington in her DC office. And then we had her out to the district. And so I sent a picture of the district event where the Congresswoman looked great. She was with the kids. It was a wonderful image. So I sent it to the chief of staff and the LD and I said, just wanted you to know we had this great event. Really appreciate all your support. I got wonderful, warm responses back. So you often can be that connector to the district and DC because sometimes they aren't always talking to each other and they're definitely not always sending and sharing pictures. So that's nice. Next slide, please. Letter writing campaigns, super, super valuable. This is grassroots mobilization at its heart. And again, my colleagues already talked about this. So you can just go to house.gov, type in your zip code at the top right corner, and it will tell you your member of Congress. Occasionally, you might need to put in the full address. But for the most part, you can fairly easily get it. And then you can just click on the Contact Us webpage on the member's website, and then you can enter in your message. And, just like everything else you've said, short and sweet and to the point is really important, connecting back to the district, that you are a constituent, why it matters to you, very important. And then if you can time it around what's happening. So right now we're in the appropriations crunch. Many are talking about potential shutdown. October 1 is the new fiscal year. So sending a message about, I understand that you are in the midst of appropriations negotiations, and we hope that you will consider sufficient funding for epilepsy's programs, for example. That's a way to relate it to what's going on now. Whereas in January, a similar message might be, as you begin the appropriations process, we want you to consider, et cetera. So little touches like that are nice. I don't think it's mandatory, but it's nice. Following up. And I think it's really nice if you've done these meetings in person or by Zoom, and you also do the letter writing campaign into the official Contact Us link, let the LA know. Say, hey, wanted you to know, we think about 10 letters have come in. Just wanted to give you a heads up. That's really nice for that health legislative assistant to get that heads up that there's some letters coming in. And so you'll get bonus points with that staffer. And it's, hey, another excuse to talk to them again. So And then the final thing about letter writing campaigns, it is phenomenal when you can get a bunch of organizations together to co-sign a letter to the chair and ranking member of the committee, for example, or the president, similar to the letter that we all did. We had 200 something co-signatures on it, which was great. So sometimes it's good to do organizational co-signature letters. And then other times it's good just to do the grassroots. I mean, it's all good. But any way that you can touch your member of Congress is going to be impactful. Next slide, please. Examples of impact. I think the example that I quickly wanted to share is that Gabi and I got to meet with the chair of the Senate Appropriations, Labor, Health, and Human Services and Education Subcommittee. That is Chairwoman Tammy Baldwin of Wisconsin. And when she heard Gabi's story, she was very moved. You could tell she was really absorbing and she was thinking about questions, and she started asking really insightful questions. I remember one of her first questions was, so it's a continuum. That's what I'm hearing. Epilepsy is a continuum. Can you explain how that works? And both of us were like, wow, she's really listening. She's really getting it. She just had some great interest and follow-up discussion. And then within a matter of weeks, the Senate appropriations bill came out and included language that we had been advocating for. So it does work to talk to these members of Congress and their staff. We also talked to her staff at length as well. So that was one example that I had to share. And I believe at this point, I am passing it back.
I can jump in and share a quick example. The photo that's actually on the slide on the left is one of the advocates that I have the privilege of working with, Shari, and if you can believe it or not, the person she's sitting next to is a member of Congress who is not all dressed up. She was at a town hall event during August recess where she, I think this was the first time she got to meet Congressman Lawler in person, but she has been really engaged in working with his office and sharing her story, and had been successful in getting him to join the caucus. And she learned that he's really interested in veterans and has been, sharing a lot of information about one of the community's appropriations priorities, which are related to the Veterans Epilepsy Centers of Excellence. And many of the advocates that I work with have been having August recess meetings back in the district and meeting with staff, as well as so in-person and virtual meetings throughout August recess, which is when members of Congress leave DC and go back to their home state or home district. And many of the advocates have been really successful in getting their member to join the caucus. And then I think last summer, I believe, many of our advocates, had been meeting with their members of Congress, and we were able to secure the out-of-pocket cap in Medicare Part D, thanks to many of them sharing their own stories, as well as the passage of the Medical Cannabis Research Act. I'm not sure what has a longer title, but you get the gist of it.
I have another example that I can share too. We had one of our advocates, we do our fly-in typically at the end of February, and one of our advocates came and met with an office and then was on her way home, and the congressperson happened to be on her plane or on her flight back to her home state. And so she just talked to her. She hadn't met with the congressperson or the congresswoman in her meeting. She'd met with a staffer, but then so it gave her extra opportunity to share her story with the congresswoman, and who was so moved that she actually later on, we have TSC Global Awareness Day on May 15th, and she gave a speech on the floor shortly after that to talk about the importance of TSC, awareness for TSC, and to share this family story. And I think that was something that was kind of neat because it wasn't necessarily our original ask, but it was an added thing that the congresswoman thought, oh, this is another thing that I can do to help. So sometimes even when you go into the meeting, you may be able to get things that you hadn't thought of or that you might not have asked for.
Wonderful. That was amazing. Thank you all for presenting. I think you guys put out some consistent information, right? There's some consistency, brief, to the point, impactful, on topic, thank yous. So I definitely keep learning every time I hear from all of you. Are there any questions or thoughts from those joining us, or comments about your experiences? We'd love to hear from you. Or Laura and Joanna, you guys do a lot of leadership in this space. Is there anything you would add, or, like to stress for the community on this topic?
Just that, I'm really glad the community is, producing this evergreen resource. And, organizations, I think, could, use this webinar and the past ones we've done and push it out to their communities, because I know this is something that a lot of orgs want to do more of, but, don't necessarily have the in-house expertise or time to do. So just want to emphasize, I'm glad we're doing this. Hope a lot of people watch the recording, and as you do, and if you have questions, then, definitely reach out to any of the great speakers on today's webinar, and we're happy to provide, additional technical assistance as you, build out your advocacy programs. But, the last thing I'll say is, none of the policy achievements that the epilepsy community or any community has ever accomplished have happened without the personal stories of advocates. It's what makes what we do real, and helps elected officials prioritize what they're doing. They're hearing from a gazillion different constituencies, and they have to determine what their own priorities are. So again, the louder the epilepsy's community voice is, and the more of us that are doing this, the even more impact we'll have.
And I'll just add, I put this in the chat, but the chat probably doesn't go with the recording. I guess I don't know how that works, but I want to emphasize something that Britt said early on in her presentation, that members of Congress really want to hear from their constituents. I see our job as professional kind of DC lobbying advocacy types to translate whatever craziness is happening in DC for people living with epilepsy, their caregivers, their loved ones, their providers, to be able to understand the context of DC to tell their story, so that they can do that kind of hook, line, and sinker that Britt mentioned. I think it can feel overwhelming to know where to start and to know kind of your point of entry. And so I just want to emphasize, it really is a matter of telling your story. And if you aren't sure that bill number or that complicated policy thing, to Laura's point, we can help you figure all that out. It's a great point for follow-up, but the thing that you can do that I can't is make that personal connection about your story, your life, and your members of Congress. We collectively can help with all the rest. So I just wanted to kind of underscore, it's so important and so necessary for regular people, for lack of a better word, to get involved.
Jada, you're muted.
Joanna, I think you just answered my question in many ways. And it was about the challenge of, particularly if we're asking for new funding, which is often the case, that the political environment is so constrained with budgets that are talking about slashing and decreasing and cuts. So in that environment, how do you make sense of really persisting to ask for an increase when everything is being cut?
Yeah, that's
and in a way, I think your answer was the context. Really, your story matters, and maybe you keep it from being cut worse.
Right. I think knowing what to ask for is given the climate. You know, if we're in a climate of cuts, then getting level funded is pretty awesome. So I think you have to adjust what you ask for based on the climate. That is absolutely true. I also think there's ways to explain why investment will actually save dollars down the road. And, you know, some members are open to that. Some are not, but some are. So, you know, again, you tailor your message for who you're talking to. And also remember, and I literally heard Chair Granger say this recently. She's like, 10 million, that's a drop in the bucket. That's nothing. So, you know, keep in mind that, you know, a few million here or there is doable, but 100 million, you know, suddenly new increase in the appropriations bill is not. That's just not going to happen. So.
I also, if I could just jump in again, was meeting with an appropriations subcommittee chair staffer once and kind of having this conversation. We were continuing a request. This was outside of epilepsy for a big increase for a program, and we had the same number every year. We wanted to get it high. And we kind of said, like, should we lower our ask? You know, should we be asking for something more realistic? To Liz's point, it's a lot easier. It's still hard, but it's easier to get, you know, another million, another 5 million. And what he said was, if the community's not asking for the big number, I can't ask for the big number on your behalf. You know, that if we ask for what we really think is necessary, it gives the staff and members who want to be helpful kind of, I don't want to say cover, but it helps them justify the incremental steps. So I guess I think, like most things in advocacy, it's a yes and, you know, we should understand the context and we should be realistic in what we can achieve. And also we should always keep in mind that, like, what are we trying to build to, and somehow do all of that in 15 minutes or less. So, you know, that's the challenge.
I wanted to throw out a few extra things too, which is that I am newer to this space, but I've been mentored by people like Liz and Laura and Jayetta, particularly through some of the EAN work that we've been doing, that about how to have these meetings. And one thing that I think is really important is also understanding where they're coming from. So, like, before I go into these meetings, I read about their experiences. So before we had a meeting with a senator, I would look on their website. What's important to them? What have they supported in the past? Like, what do they identify with? You know, do they have a kid who's been sick before? Have they been sick before? Are they a caregiver? Those kinds of things. And those are kind of things that you can refer to, or even just know that that's worth mentioning from your experience, because then they can personally draw a connection from it. So that, you know, it doesn't feel like, okay, here, this person over here who has their story and I can't relate to it, but which is not always the case. I mean, people can relate to some pretty powerful experiences that we have, even if it doesn't, you know, they haven't experienced it. But to me, that felt important to also understand how they're coming to the table to experience what I'm putting in front of them. Yeah. Let's see. Yeah, no, it's a great. Thanks, Roxanne. Yeah, they might have had personal experiences that can help them relate to your story. I mean, another really powerful thing that we've been doing in some of the meetings that we've been having is just opening by saying, hey, do you know anybody with epilepsy? And it's really powerful to hear the number. I mean, it shouldn't be surprising, right? 1 in 26, everybody who works on Capitol Hill probably has some connection somehow. But it was really powerful to hear the stories, people saying, yes, I actually have epilepsy, or my daughter has epilepsy, or my best friend in high school did. And so it allows these meetings to open with this sense of, like, understanding their personal connection to it, or that they're interested in learning more. They may be honest that they don't know anything or know anyone. So that also feels like a really nice way to open talking about a topic like this. Great. Anyone else have anything to add? Any experiences or questions? Or, I mean, I think this is a powerful resource to come back to and refer to. I think I'm probably going to come back and watch this a couple more times before I go out and do some of my other meetings. But feel free to chime in here. And, if you're watching this online, these are people who have been in the epilepsy space for a long time and probably will be for many years to come. So feel free to reach out, look them up, ask your questions, engage. And as always, feel free to reach out to, ELC to let us know if there are things you'd like us to continue talking about. This 3-part series covered a lot of ground. But if you still have questions, if you still are uncertain about things, if there is more that you would like us to keep digging into or share with you all, please let us know, because we want to really build the momentum and for epilepsy community members to continue to voice and be present and be sharing their stories and be advocating. And I think it was Liz who was saying it, I believe, if it wasn't, excuse me, but, the more we can show up in numbers and people continue to hear epilepsy, 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 it'll start triggering and they say, oh gosh, yeah, I've been hearing a lot about that. We have got to fund something with epilepsy that's more significant. So, keep doing it. It's not a one and done, as we heard. Keep talking, keep engaging. Every year you can get another meeting, right? Go back and say, hey, I'd love to follow up with you and share like how things have progressed for us or how things have changed for us. So thank you for tuning in. Thank you for sharing your stories. Thank you for engaging. Thank you for helping push forward the understanding and the stories of epilepsy and all the different forms of epilepsies, so that we are building our army. Anyone else want to share any final thoughts? Great. Thank you all. Take care.